My name is Jonathan Shields. I'm the Principal Examiner for GCSE Business Studies, which is the 5BS03 component that makes up either your GCSE in Business Studies or your GCSE in Business Communications or your GCSE in Business and Economics. And I'm going to take you through a number of slides and some control assessment samples today, and we're going to have a look at those and try and decide why they're being given the mark that they have and what we can learn from that. So, the aims and objectives are really quite simple. We're going to look at the assessment criteria, and we're going to look at some assessment materials. We're going to do some practice exercises, and then, of course, we're going to answer and ask some questions. So, before we move on, let's just have a look at the agenda. Going to give you a little bit of feedback from 2012. We're going to have a look at a standardization sample, controlled assessment script 5. Then we're going to have a little break. Then we've got a second, totally different controlled assessment script. Then we're going to finish off with some questions. Okay, there's some polls that are going to come in from our host now. I want to learn a little bit more about you, what you want from this session, so that I can tailor what I'm saying to your specific. Okay, thank you for that. We had 3 polls in play just then. The first poll was asking if you're new to controlled assessment, and what I can see is essentially it's not far away from being a 50-50 split. We've got 7 people who are new, and then 12 people who are old hands, as it were. The second question, did your internal marks get changed during the moderation process? It's a full-on 50-50 split. So 50% of the people online said yes, 50% said no. And looking through the comments regarding what is the single most important thing you hope to take away from this session, almost all of the comments are about confidence with the marking and placing the controlled assessment criteria in the right level, an understanding of what evaluation means, an understanding of what analysis means. These are all the kind of things which are coming through. And hopefully by the end of the session today, we will be in a position where we will have been through 2 controlled assessment scripts, and that hopefully should give us a better insight as to how to go about marking this. Okay. I just want to run through where the controlled assessment comes from and where it fits in. This is specific, really, to the people who are new to controlled assessment. So controlled assessment, 5BSO2, is based around the small business. And the controlled assessment titles come from the 5BSO1 part of the specification. And so as you can see here, this is the 5BSO1 spec. And I'm just scrolling through it here. Topic 1.1, spotting a business opportunity. You can see there bullet point 2, market mapping. And that translates very nicely down here to the controlled assessment titles. So you can see there, controlled assessment title 1, brackets 1.1, telling us the part of the 5BSO1 specification that controlled assessment title comes from. It's about market mapping, so that translates very nicely to bullet point 1.1, section 2 on market mapping. Now that's quite important because obviously we've moved back towards a linear GCSE and away from a modular GCSE. So in the past, you used to do Module 1, 5BSO1 first, then you would do your controlled assessment. Now, some centres, looking for economies of scale, have thought, what parts of 5BSO4 and 5BSO5 and 5BSO3 overlap nicely with 5BSO1? I'm going to teach that in a thematic way, so therefore I can cover all of that section on marketing in one big hit. Now, you've got to be a little bit careful there, because the controlled assessment is based around a small business, and it's based around the material in the 5BS1 part of the syllabus, not 5BS03, 04, or 05. Izumi, could we move on to the assessment objectives, please? Okay, maybe you can just scroll down a little bit here, and the assessment objectives will be on the end. Okay, you can see there that the controlled assessment's got 4 assessment objectives. We've got research, we've got presenting information and data, and we have got analysis and evaluation. So the whole of the controlled assessment is marked out of 40, which is then converted to a UMS score marked out of 50. Now, when we look at the controlled assessment samples, we're going to be breaking down each candidate's controlled assessment into those 4 different elements. Okay, now these are a couple of changes that you really do need to be focused on because there is the potential for mistakes. Now we've moved to a linear rather than modular course. We're trying to get the controlled assessment titles out earlier. Now what that means is in January 2013, there will be 2 sets of controlled assessment tasks on the Edexcel website. So in January 2013, there will be the controlled assessment tasks that need to be submitted in May of 2013, and there'll also be the controlled assessment tasks for June 2014. So you have to make sure that you use the right controlled assessment task titles for the correct cohort. Now that's absolutely crucial because if you do not use the correct titles, the rules are that you have to use the titles for the Year 11 part of the course. So if you've got a cohort that started in September 2012, you have to use the titles that are due for submission in June of 2014. So you really need to be focused on that. You can't interchange the titles. One set of titles per cohort. Now, what did candidates do well in last year's control assessments? Well, students clearly moved along a learning curve after the previous year. Much better performance overall, much clearer focus on the investigation title. So those teachers who came along to the feedback sessions last year, they went back into their centres and they said to their students, you've got to answer the question. You've got to focus on the investigation title. There was also a much greater range of businesses, and students clearly felt empowered by the fact that they could choose their own business. Now, I know a lot of teachers have this issue about the fact that students can't get access to small businesses. We didn't find that. We found a huge range of small businesses being used, from window cleaners to corner shops to fast food bars. Very, very good. So, again, really important that you don't turn around to your students in your centre and say to them, you have to do your controlled assessment task on this particular business. That's not to be recommended. Also, on the second assessment objective, the presenting data and presenting information, the organisation of the work was much, much better. So what you had was lots of subheadings. The organisation of the controlled assessment task was done much better. It was more readable. It was easy to mark. There was use of footnotes. There were appendices that were footnoted back to the actual main body of the controlled assessment. So centres and cohorts clearly had got better between last year and this year. Now, what can we do to improve? Again, we want to move away from a mindset whereby every student in a given centre does one controlled assessment title. That there's a choice of 5. And the whole thinking behind the design of this course was to empower students, to make it their controlled assessment. So please don't direct your students too much and say, you've got to do that particular controlled assessment. Now, with that in mind, some of the controlled assessment tasks are easier than other controlled assessment tasks. So you might just want to have a look at that. Yeah, some are a little bit more challenging than perhaps others. Others might suit your students, your candidates, more than other controlled assessment tasks. Annotation, seriously important. The worst thing for a controlled assessment moderator is picking up a piece of controlled assessment and it's like a blank canvas. There's literally nothing on it other than a couple of ticks or a sentence at the end. Now, in that situation, the person who's moderating your work has got absolutely no idea as to why you awarded it that particular level and that particular mark in each of the 4 assessment objectives. So, by not annotating your work, you're not mitigating the risk of downward moderation. You're making it more likely because you're asking people to try and climb inside your head and understand your mindset. The more annotation you do, and the more you can relate it back to the level descriptors in the assessment objectives and criteria, the less likely it is that it's going to be moderated downwards. Research, another big thing here. I'm going to touch on this now, but I'll mention it a little bit later on. Research, very important, but you have to move away. You have to get candidates to move away from this mindset that as much research as possible equals a brilliant mark. It doesn't. It's actually counterproductive. In the assessment criteria for research, it refers to this phrase, selectivity and focus. What does selectivity and focus mean? You need to be gaining research that actually answers the question. It has to help you answer the controlled assessment task. So if you're doing a questionnaire that has 30 questions in it, what is the point in those 30 questions if only 2 of them actually help you to answer the controlled assessment task? The remaining 28 are superfluous to requirements. And that's a common error that is made by students. They think quantity equals quality. It doesn't. Really focus and using and finding research that helps you to answer the question. That is crucial. Another one that is worth just pointing out there is the use of photos. Throwing a photo in and doing nothing with that photo is just a waste of time. If that photo helps you answer the controlled assessment task, then more use can be made of that, and that will then demonstrate good selectivity and focus. And in the presenting of the research, again, that's variable in quality. You have some centres who have got their candidates to do graphs that are meaningful and help answer the question, so therefore are helping with the good selectivity and focus, and they are clearly labelled and they are accurate. And then there are other centres who are submitting graphs for the sake of submitting graphs because they've seen that they need to present information using a variety or range of appropriate methods. The graphs, if they're to be drawn, have to help answer the question. You have to do something with them. The best way to remove all these snags and potential pitfalls for students is to get your students to do a practice controlled assessment. That's absolutely crucial. Now, the practice controlled assessment cannot be on the same controlled assessment task as the one they are going to do live. It has to be either on the previous year's controlled assessment tasks or on a different controlled assessment task. That's crucial. You can't do a dry run on the controlled assessment task that the student intends to submit as part of their final qualification. So, let's take each of the assessment criteria, each of the 4 assessment criteria, research, presenting information and data, analysis, and evaluation in turn. Now, I've touched on this research assessment criteria before. We have to move away from that mindset that quantity equals quality. It doesn't. It really is a case of less is more. If you look at the assessment criteria for the controlled assessment, It refers to, in level 1, research from one source using limited selectivity and focus. In level 2, research from more than one source showing some selectivity and focus. Now, in last year's feedback events, lots of teachers were asking what is meant by research from more than one source. More than one source is 2 or more. So long as you've got 2 or more pieces of research, you are fine. Some controlled assessment tasks are allied to much more research, whereas other controlled assessment tasks, it's much more difficult to do the research. It really depends on the title. But you can access the top level on research from 2 or more. The key thing is the selectivity and focus. The selectivity and focus are the questions in the questionnaire tailored to gaining information in a way which can be presented, which helps you answer the control assessment task. I don't need to know what this person's income is. I don't need to know what this person's age is, because that's not helping me answer the control assessment task. It's a waste of time. So the candidate putting those kind of questions into a questionnaire is not going to score highly on selectivity and focus. Throwing some photos in of the product. Again, that's not demonstrating good selectivity and focus unless the control assessment task is asking something about the product and something is then done with the photo that illustrates that the product has high levels of creativity or high levels of innovation. It depends really on the controlled assessment task. No need for both primary and secondary research. That's a hangover from previous business specifications where coursework was involved and it was recommended that primary and secondary research are needed. Some controlled assessment tasks, you might not be able to do any primary research. Indeed, there was one a couple of years ago which was involved with the price of commodities changing over time. Virtually impossible to do any primary research on that one. So that's a misnomer. It can be all primary, it can be all secondary, or it can be a mix of primary and secondary. And as I said, range of sources means more than one, i.e. 2 or more. Presentation assessment criteria. Now, I put in red there that the level descriptor refers to attention to detail. Now, what's meant by that is, are the graphs accurate? Have they been drawn to a high degree of accuracy? Am I able to read the information? If it's percentages, am I able to read that off on the vertical axis easily? Are the axes labelled? And again, a teacher who wants to mitigate the risk of downward moderation would want to perhaps do some annotation on those graphs or charts or diagrams, explaining how that diagram satisfies the criteria in the present information or data assessment objectives. Many controlled assessments that did very, very well in this assessment criteria last year used appendices and used footnotes. Now, appendices can be a little bit dangerous. What we don't want submitted are huge appendices. Appendices that contain things like carrier bags from the business, promotional flyers from the business, a printout of every single web page on the business's website. That's a disaster, because that, again, is illustrative of poor selectivity and focus on the research assessment criteria. So the appendices should be a relatively thin part of the controlled assessment. And if there is a part of analysis which needs to link to the appendices to show that actually I've used the research in helping me to answer the controlled assessment question, it might be a good idea to insert a footnote. A footnote which links that particular part of the analysis to the piece of evidence that is being discussed. And again, subheadings, as we'll see later on, when we look at a couple of the controlled assessment tasks and mark them, really help in just the readability and the flow of the controlled assessment. and it's also going to help students to order their ideas and well. Now, this is why I mentioned footnotes, because the analysis assessment criteria must use their research data, and that footnote link is creating the physical match between where they've done the analysis and their data, enabling the control assessment task to move up the level for analysis. And what does analysis involve? Analysis involves actually answering the controlled assessment question, saying, why this factor is important, why it causes this, what are the consequences of this. And just like you'll have noticed in the mark schemes for 5BSO3, 5BSO4, and 5BSO5, to demonstrate analysis, you can use linking words. Good examples of which, because, therefore, thus, as a result. It just gets students thinking about linking ideas together. If they're linking ideas together that answer the controlled assessment task, they're answering the question. And if they're answering the question, they're going to get good marks. Many controlled assessments that fail to do very well often write around the question but don't actually answer the question. Final assessment criteria, which is evaluation. Again, the weakest area of the 4 assessment objectives that are tested. Now, again, there is the mindset that evaluation is simply, oh, I've done my controlled assessment, now I need to look at the things that I could have done to improve my controlled assessment. So you get a section at the end that says, I've done a questionnaire. I asked 15 people in the questionnaire, but I wish I'd actually have asked 30 people in the questionnaire, because if I had have done that, I would have been able to get results which are more statistically valid. That's not really what evaluation is about. Evaluation is really making some kind of judgment and supporting that judgment as to which factor is the most important, bearing in mind what the controlled assessment task is asking. So, we're going to look at some controlled assessments in a few minutes, which ask about the importance of differing methods of promotion. Now, that title for the controlled assessment task hasn't just been plucked out of thin air. It's been carefully thought about to allow the students to be able to demonstrate the assessment objectives. So if you've got several different forms of promotion, evaluation would come in students saying, actually, this is the most significant, or this is the most important form of promotion for this particular business because. Then they would explain, and then we would see some linking words, therefore, thus, as a result, and you've got the evaluation, and you've also got the analysis. Okay? So evaluation, you're making a judgment as to what is the most important factor, and then you are justifying it. Or you're saying, well, look, this is important, however, there are some drawbacks. And as a result of these drawbacks, this actually causes this factor to decline in importance. And those skills are fairly generic. Those skills can be taught as part of the controlled assessment, but it'd also be applicable to 5BSO3, building a business, 5BSO4, business communications, and 5BSO5, introduction to economic understanding. Now, we're going to have a go at an activity. And the first activity is going to be based around the live controlled assessment task from last year, the title of which is the one that I was referring to a second ago about the most important method of promotion to a business. They're all taken from live centres. It's a centre up in Rotherham. And what I'd like you to do is spend 10 to 15 minutes reading through the controlled assessment. The assessment objectives will appear at the bottom of your screen. And then once you've completed marking the controlled assessment, I would like you to submit the mark range, the level band, if you like, that you think that particular controlled assessment should fit into for research, presentation, analysis, and evaluation, because that's how it would be marked by your moderator. They would take each of the 4 assessment criteria in isolation and mark it, and then at the end, that's where you would get your total from. So if we could do that now, and I'll speak to you again in around about 10 or 15 minutes when we have the feedback on that. Thank you. Okay, Leisha, thank you very much for your comment there. Everybody has now voted. So if we can have a look at the results, and we'll take it by assessment objective first of all. I can see here that in the research assessment objective, around about 48% of people have placed it in the 4 to 6 band, with 33.3% in the 1 to 3 band, and a reasonably small percentage thought it was much better than that and placed it in the 7 to 9 band. Now on research, at standardization, this particular script was placed in the 4 to 6 band. Why was it placed in the 4 to 6 band? It was placed into the 4 to 6 band because there is research from more than one source, and there was some selectivity. Each of the sources was about a bus company. We had a timetable. We had a picture of a bus. We had an arrow that pointed towards fitted seatbelts. We then had a advertising hoarding that looks like a picture of a bus has been superimposed onto it. There is a leaflet that just appears to be generic. There's a picture of a radio, which doesn't really do much other than reinforce the idea that they could use radio as a form of promotion. So we placed that in the 4 to 6 band because there was some selectivity. Not good selectivity, some selectivity. So therefore we awarded that 4. Moving on to the second mark band, which is presenting research and data. I can see from the polls that a good 72% of you have gone for the 3-4 mark band. Okay, and that's exactly where we placed it. Presenting information, a limited range of methods, and some attention to detail. So yeah, okay, there weren't really any graphs in it because the student hadn't collected any information which they could demonstrate in a graphical way. But we did have subheadings and we did have a degree of organization about the project. So therefore we felt that there was a limited range of methods demonstrated and some attention to detail. So we placed that in the 3 to 4 mark range. So just to recap, for research, we actually gave that particular script 4 at the bottom of the 4 to 6 mark range, and for presenting information and data, we also awarded that script 4 at the top of the 3 to 4 mark range, which is very, very similar, looking at the polls, as to where the delegates online right at this moment placed that particular piece of controlled assessment. Moving on to the analysis. Now, I noticed in running there was quite a bit of typing going on about spelling, punctuation and grammar, because of course we have an asterisk attached to analysis and evaluation. Now, really, don't lose too much sleep over spelling, punctuation and grammar. Okay? Really, we're trying to place the controlled assessment according to the level descriptor, and we might then make an amendment within a given level if the spelling, punctuation and grammar is really, really shocking. And I mean shocking. Okay? So on this particular controlled assessment, that there were some spelling mistakes. So for example, I think the student kept mentioning spelling the word depot without the T, but it was legible. The information could, the student was getting the information across to us. There were a few kind of contrived sentences, but the spelling, punctuation, and grammar I wouldn't really have thought would get in the way of where I would want to place that in analysis. And I can see here, looking at the polls, that 57.1% of you placed it in the 4 to 6 band, and 38.1% of you placed it in the 1 to 3 mark band. Well, at standardisation, we place that particular control assessment just into the 4 to 6 band. So we gave that 4. So if you were giving it 3 or you were giving it 4, you were right on the money. And essentially the reason why was that there was simple analysis. The candidate had collected some information and had tried to do something with the information. So simple analysis was demonstrated. And finally, for the evaluation, you can see that the vast majority of people, 76.1% of the delegates, placed it in the 1 to 2 marking band, and that's exactly where we at standardisation placed the controlled assessment. Limited evaluation. There was that kind of tautology in the conclusion. The conclusion was quite difficult to understand and kind of was just saying the same thing in different words at the beginning. But there were some elements of evaluative comment, something about the fact that people might not see it, or people who are on the bus would only see it, so what's the point of that? And maybe it's going to be quite expensive. So there was some very simplistic evaluation that enabled us to award that at the top of the first marking range, so that was given 2 marks. So, if we can move on to the next slide, Izumi. That was the overall situation. You can see there research 4 marks, presentation 4 marks, analysis 4 marks, evaluation 2 marks, total marks 14 out of 40. Now what does 14 out of 40 mean? Well, in June 2012, 14 out of 40, that would be converted into, let me just have a look at this, that would be converted into a low E. So the candidate would be getting probably around about 17 out of 50 UMS on that one. Okay, we're going to have a look at a different control assessment script now. Same title as before, which is going to be useful in illustrating the contrast between the two. And obviously, as you can see, you've got a delegate pack there, which you can download, and you can give these to your students with the assessment criteria and get your students to, if you like, peer mark them. And then they hopefully should be able to see the contrast between one which is not so good and only just gained an E grade, and one which is altogether a different kettle of fish. Now, I'm conscious that we went over, according to our agenda, in the first half of the session. So I'm going to give you sort of 8 to 10 minutes to try and find the mark this time. So we're trying to make it a little bit more precise, because before we were looking for the level with controlled assessment sample 5. Now we're looking at controlled assessment sample 3, and we're actually trying to find a specific mark. So I can see Izumi has put up the controlled assessment on screen for you, and I can see that the assessment criteria there as well. Okay, welcome back. Range of marks here in the polls for this particular control assessment. Now, in previous feedback meetings, we've often been asked, what does a perfect controlled assessment look like? Well, what we've got here is a candidate who has managed to create a 40 out of 40 response. So, on the research, top of the mark range 4, 10 to 12 marks, detailed relevant research from a wide range of sources together with high quality organization of materials and focus. Yes, the research that was done here is all about methods of promotion that this particular business could have used in its marketing mix. So, looking at the polls we had on that particular area there, well, 33.3% of you went for the top of level 4, and a further 5.56% of people went for 11. So that, I guess, therefore, we're almost in the majority, with some people going slightly below that at the top of the the bottom of that particular level. So, you know, everybody's in the right level, apart from a few people who are much lower down. we couldn't really see what else the student could be expected to do. So, essentially, they've looked at lots of different methods of promotion. They've got good selectivity and focus. All of the methods of promotion are applicable to the business. Now, I know that there are some people in the chat who were talking about the idea of, well, national magazines aren't really relevant, and that's got to be an example of poor selectivity and focus. Now, just got to be a little bit careful there, because within the controlled assessment, although it's got pictures of national magazines like the Clothes Show magazine and Clothes magazine, it doesn't actually mention using national magazines. It just mentions using magazines. And I guess what the candidate was trying to do there was to try and create a case for the use of a magazine for this particular small business, be it a local magazine or otherwise. And later on, when you get to the evaluation and the ranked order, and the way in which that ranked order has been put together is quite nice, the candidate actually mentions the fact that the magazines might be quite expensive, so therefore might not be the thing to do. So that's the issue there with that. So we thought that was definitely a top-level research, and we went for 12 marks. Moving on to the second assessment criteria, again, looking at the choices here that are on the polls, the majority have it. 41.1% went for the top of level 4, and again, this was awarded 8. It's a really well presented piece of controlled assessment. The graphs are accurate. The photographs are relevant and referred to. There's talk there about using social networking. It's a very, very good piece of work, bearing in mind the fact they've had to do this in 3 hours in controlled conditions. Moving on to the analysis, more of a range there for the analysis. But again, if you look at the level, and the level's the key thing, yeah? 35.2% of the poll went to 10, 17.6 to 11, 29.4. You add all that together, you're around about 80% of the people who are in this online training placing the analysis right at the exact correct level. And again, it's this kind of glass ceiling. What else could we expect a student to do in 3 hours to get better than that? So again, we went for the top of the mark band on analysis. And evaluation, a little bit more of a mix, yeah? But what you might want to take back into centres there is the way in which this evaluation has been organised, because the ranking of suggested promotional ideas, yeah, is a very good way in order to generate importance of the various promotional ideas. And again, we went for the top of level 4 on that one. We went for 8 marks. And looking at the percentages, what's that? 66.6% of delegates placed it in the top level, and it's the top level that's the key thing. So long as you're getting it in the right level, then your annotation will be able to justify, hopefully, why it's at the top of that level or maybe at the bottom of that level. Within a level like evaluation, where it's only 7 or 8, the difference between 7 and 8 is only 1. It's, again, very, very difficult to laser in degrees of accuracy prove that that is an 8 or that is a 7. Okay? Yeah, so just to recap, that was given 40 out of 40, and obviously 40 out of 40. Well, you needed 36 out of 40 to get bottom A star in terms of UMS. 36 out of 40 in 2012 would give you 45 out of 50 UMS. So 40 out of 40 is going to give you 50 out of 50 UMS. And you could probably have ended up with 39, 38, and you'd still have got probably around about the full UMS, looking at the raw to UMS thresholds that you can find on the Edexcel website. So I'm now going to move on. The statistics page, really, if you want to have a look at the grade boundaries, which I mentioned earlier on in the presentation, you can find them by following that hyperlink. And the statistics you're looking for there is where the raw thresholds are to generate a certain number of UMS points. And as I said earlier, students tend to find the control assessment harder than perhaps 5BSO1 or 5BSO3, 4, and 5. So generally speaking, a lower level of performance on the control assessment relative to the other units. And I think that's captured by the fact that to get a C, you need 25 out of 40 in the 2012 year. Training. Lots of opportunities for training. EdXL have asked the open question, what other training would you find useful? You know, they're always looking for ideas and suggestions as to how we can best support you. And one of the things I really like about EdXL is they, generally speaking, especially on this business course, tend to employ existing teachers as principal examiners and chief examiners. So, you know, we're facing the same kind of issues that you people are in your centres as well. Now,